A 2-week ceasefire is in place after a blistering 6 weeks of the Iran war. But the economic fallout isn't pausing with it. So what else should we brace ourselves for? Hi guys, I'm Natasha and welcome to another episode of The Usual Place. Now, hours before the ceasefire kicked in, the Singapore government announced in Parliament support measures to help cushion the blow of rising costs. But with any real solution still in limbo, questions remain. Like, what are the long-term effects of this war on our economy and diplomacy? And will diesel and petrol prices come back down soon? Also, will we need more CDC vouchers and handouts down the line? Now, to help us make sense of the effects of the Iran war on Singapore, I have two economists. And the first one, the nearest one next to me, is Danny Quah, the Ka Shing Professor in economics at Kuan School of Public Policy. And Danny, you study international economic relations and the shifting world order. So this is very up your alley. And so I'm hoping to tap on your expertise in a bit. And next to you on the couch, I have Sheana Yue, senior economist at Oxford Economics, a global economic advisory firm. Now, you have a focus on macroeconomic research, analysis, and a forecast on China and Singapore. So welcome to The Usual Place, both of you. And I want to start with what's been happening in Iran, actually, because we're talking about the Iran war, but it's been a volatile few days over what's been happening. Overnight, we went from President Trump threatening to wipe out Iranian civilization to a 2-week ceasefire. Then oil prices dropped and Iran said they'll reopen the Strait of Hormuz. What do you think when you read or see the frequent updates along the way? Maybe, Danny, we can start with you.
Well, as you allude to, we see a lot of variability, certainly in Trump's pronouncements, but also in facts on the ground. The 2-week ceasefire that I think all of us are hopeful will grow into something more stable is at this very moment, within hours of its being announced, potentially at risk. The interpretations of it have been different. Israel has continued to go after Hezbollah groups in Lebanon, saying that this was not covered by the ceasefire. The Iranians say we thought they were. The Americans have one understanding of what's happening with nuclear enrichment. The Iranians have something different. So if this ceasefire does last 2 weeks, it will already be an achievement. There are those who say that, well, the facts on the ground won't have changed in 2 weeks, so it will just be more of the same after. I disagree. I think that the 2-week space, this pause, helps the interested participants really rethink what they're doing. The American people, for one, are probably at this point in shock of the speed and the scale with which their armed forces have seen action in yet another part of the world. This is a war that they are very much against, and they need to think through what's exactly happening. The primary question for them is, speaking, if I were an American, are we safer as a result of this war? Is my political leadership helping make my economy and my fellow citizens a more prosperous, more secure society? And I think there are real questions that they need to unpack. A 2-week space gives them the room to do that.
Yes. Sheana, you're agreeing. What's your take?
I do agree that this 2 weeks does give everybody some time to just rethink, reevaluate where they stand, whether it makes more sense to continue on the path that has already been for the last 6 weeks. But also, as mentioned, it is something quite fragile at the moment. It will be an achievement if we get to 2 weeks. So for us, at least, we're just waiting and just wanting to wait and see how that progresses in the coming 13 days.
Yeah. Well, this war has very significant impacts on Singapore's economy. How is the uncertainty actually impacting our economy?
Yeah. Well, there is a sense in which this shock is like all other supply shocks that we in Singapore or elsewhere in the world have faced in the last 80 years. If it's a supply shock, the uncertainty makes investors more wary. They hold back making firm commitments. It makes consumers feel less secure. They hold back on spending. So that leads to the possibility that the supply shock will raise prices and reduce output. So that means unemployment will increase, That means growth will slow down. At the same time that we see inflation take off, many people use the word stagflation. It's not a bad word. It combines stagnation and inflation. And what policymakers need to do when faced with stagflation are a very precise set of actions that they need to undertake. They need to hit a sweet spot between keeping the economy going, not letting those who are most exposed and most vulnerable to feel severe economic pain, but also not accelerating inflation. And that's a sweet spot that every government, every policymaker needs to try and target right now.
Sheana, is your job very difficult now because there's like so much uncertainty about, because it changes pretty much by the hour.
Yes.
Yeah, but how is this uncertainty impacting the Singapore economy?
Well, it has been making my job more exciting since the start of March. So we typically in Oxford, we do forecasting every month, but now we're doing it twice a month. And each round is just getting more and more. We're just baking in more of the uncertainty with a little bit more certainty of what's happened, but also pushing out our view on how long this might last for. At the start of everything, at the end of February and the start of early March, most of us would probably, not just Oxford, I think everybody else was also just anticipating it to maybe be something a little bit shorter. The hardest hit would probably be a bit shorter. But now we've all kind of starting to move towards the acknowledgement, the realization that, this might actually be more prolonged. So that's how we're also moving in our forecast and baking in the uncertainty that Prof. Danny had just mentioned. So I think just all in, it's been keeping us very busy. I think every one of us very busy.
Yeah, can I jump in on this? When as participants in a market economy in Singapore or elsewhere, I think we have a tendency sometimes to oversimplify the nature of shocks that hit us. Not to underestimate them. We're fully aware of their impact, but we oversimplify them to think that they're like someone turning on a tap or a faucet. There's an action to be done, and that will help everyone. Right? And that's good. That's the right mindset for those of us who are trying to devise policies to navigate these changes. But we also need to think about what's on the other side. Who's turning on the faucet? What's the intentionality in having these shocks hit us? Now, for many, they say, the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is blockading it. And if we could just get them to remove those blockades, everything would be as before. There are those who go a level beyond that, who say, Iran is retaliating to actions that America and Israel have taken. If we get America and Israel to change their actions, then everything would be okay and it would be as before. I think the danger in that kind of oversimplification, which we do have to do, is that it doesn't actually get us very far in helping us predict what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It tells us what the mechanics and the mechanisms are, but it doesn't help us understand and predict what's going to happen. So to do that, we need to get into the mindset of the Iranians and the mindset of the Americans. And at this point, getting into the mindset of the Americans is as difficult as it is getting into the mindset of the Iranians. We used to think that, the Iranian Ayatollah, the Iranian Republican Guard, they were one layer, they controlled everything, and the people were angry at them. I think actions over the last few months have suggested that dynamic is changing. I think we used to think the Americans are a unified force. They're here to keep peace and security in the world. They're helping the rest of us be safe because Iran is not allowed to have a nuclear weapon. But what we see happening in America now also puts the lie to that simple story. The American people are very unhappy about this, and they're asking hard questions. Why exactly the American leadership, the American military have to do this? They're asking questions about what were the actual documented evidence that shows that Iran was on its way to actually having nuclear weapons, not just hearing what other people say, but what their own intelligence agency says. Their own intelligence agency has said Iran had no plans in that direction. So why is the president and the Secretary of Defense, so aggressive in pushing this military operation? They're asking those questions. They're also seeing how what's happening in the Gulf has resulted in the lifting of sanctions against Russia. Russian oil is now again being exported to the rest of the world. So it's like you shut off one tap of a nation that's an adversary, and you allow the tap on a nation that's another adversary to open. The other adversary, Russia, is actually in full-blown military conflict right now in Western Europe. So this action, for all the uncertainty that's induced in our part of the world, has also allowed the Russians to again replenish their cash buffers, to again become wealthy, to again devote that 7 to 10% of their GDP to a military contest. So we need to understand, I think it helps us in Singapore be safer if we understand the dynamics of what's going on here, not just focus on the Strait of Hormuz being cut off or American bombing. There's these dynamics at work.
So I do want to get in, so I do have a question about the shifting global order, which I will come back to later. But I want to know if there's a comparable situation that in history that we can look back on and say maybe we can take some notes from. Because as you brought up Trump, to me, like watching it across different platforms, this has all played out a lot on social media and is dominated by a lot of rhetoric on both sides, both the Iranians and the American side, which may kind of always make things a little bit more amplified than it is. So if we take away the noise, have we seen a similar situation like this in terms of the uncertainty and in terms of the economic impact?
Let me take a stab at that. Then you've got the numbers. You will give a more refined story, but let me take a stab at this. I think earlier, our discussion had gotten to where we used the word stagflation, right? A supply shock that restricts supply, raises prices, and potentially increases unemployment, lowers investment. The last time we saw a serious stagflation was another oil shock, as it turns out. In my reckoning, that was the 1973 first OPEC oil shock. Of course, at the time, they didn't know it was the first. They just called it the OPEC oil shock. But the OPEC oil shock saw a quadrupling of gas prices. For America at that time, it wasn't that big a deal because the gas price change was significant, but the Middle East did not supply that much oil to the United States. It had changed by 1979. That was far larger. But for us in Southeast Asia, it was hugely consequential. So like that quadrupling of oil price saw inflation in Singapore rise from 2% in 1973 to 22% in 1974 and 75, to at one point 30% over a 6-month period. That was a huge shock for Singapore. At the same time, the stagflation really kicked in because growth in Singapore fell from 11% to 4%. Now, what does that mean? What does falling from 11% to 4% mean? When Singapore was growing at 11%, that meant that it was becoming twice as rich every 4 years, every 6 years. That meant that when you saw your children, your daughter or your son, go off to university, by the time they finished their master's degree, you were twice as rich as before. But fall from 11% to 4% meant that you had to wait a whole generation before you could be twice as rich at 4%. It was a huge shock to Singapore. So the OPEC oil shock, I think, for me, is the echo, is what we're seeing, is the sort of the echo we need to look at to try and understand what's happening. So the downside risk is, I think, very significant. Now, I'm interested to hear the numbers, what the numbers say about your change in prediction for growth. But in the scenario I've described, the downside risk is significant from that historical analogy.
Well, Sheana, is this the same? Do you have the same like comparison, or was there an event that you can compare this to? And do you think that the way the numbers are going right now, we will see a similar event like what Danny mentioned?
Yeah, I think so. For us right now, the numbers have come down. We have downgraded it again once more. And I don't think we're going to see like as big a shock going from 11 to 4% growth. Neither are we going to see inflation going up the same way that it had from 1973 to 1974. And I think some of the reasons is because obviously since 1970s and since then to now, I guess we don't really have any other comparable kind of oil shock per se, but we also, for example, experienced that really high inflation recently in 2022, for example. And all of these episodes have actually helped, or rather steered the government into focusing and prioritizing on diversification regarding energy sources and just how the economy generally has created buffers, energy and as well as food, for example, food stockpiles. So all of these suggest to us that yes, even though we will probably still see inflation really rise much more rapidly than we have in the past year, as well as what we were initially anticipating for this year, but it's not going to be to that kind of same extent. So for us, we have upgraded our core inflation from just under 1.5% this year to now coming up to about 2.4% for this year. Just to take, yes, you've got really
numbers. As long as it sounds like it's going up, I'm also like, oh no. But do you think we're in a better position to handle this than say like in the 1970s?
I do think we are.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
And one keyword that you used, I want to, if I may, expand on a little bit because I think it's hugely important, and that's diversification. Back then, Singapore diversified its landscape of economic activity, just as Singapore is trying to do now. There are obvious things to do now, which is that, okay, this is an oil and gas shock. And yes, Singapore produces, most of electricity from natural gas. 40% of Singapore's natural gas comes from Qatar. So we're hugely affected by this right now. We should diversify. And we should diversify in smart ways. Say one immediate way is to say, stop buying so much from Qatar and, sort of geopolitically volatile areas. Let me buy more from Australia, say, for instance. That's one way to do it. But there's a larger lesson here, which is, yes, we all need energy to drive our cars, power air conditioning, broadcast on media like this. We all need energy. But why does that energy have to come from hydrocarbons? From fossil fuel. In fact, the world has been on a decades-long journey to diversify away exactly from fossil fuels. This will accelerate that towards clean, renewable energy. So we need to be thinking, what's the diversification that we need to do in our energy landscape?
And this came up in Parliament.
Absolutely.
When they said 2 days ago. And
absolutely.
Which is very interesting because this is what I want to mention because when this war started on Feb 28th, so that was like 6 weeks ago, right? And the government seemed to be taking a relatively measured approach. Like basically other countries just went, insane, right? They were like, okay, we're going to ration fuel. We're going to get people to work from home. Yes, 40 work week. I think one country had a Wednesday off randomly. But then this week, as you mentioned, that talking about diversifying different energy sources, to me, it felt like it went from 20 to 100. And with 3 ministers in Parliament talking about energy and food security and announcing support measures, which is what I mentioned, like handouts and CDC vouchers. Then yesterday, which is what the public sector said that they will be implementing energy-saving measures within government buildings. So did we just go into crisis mode?
Okay. So, if we have, we're doing it in a measured, forward-looking way. We're not, other parts of Asia are having to change their, daily lives. I was just in Bangkok, and as we saw on TV, TV presenters are having to change their attire because air conditioning has been turned off. In other parts of Asia, people are queuing up at gas stations. Now, we have a bit of breathing space to do this pivot, this diversification in a measured, calibrated way. I just want to quickly add that this is exactly what Singapore did in the mid-70s as well. I don't know if this is sort of written down and documented, so all Singaporeans are fully aware of this. But that time, when growth went from 11% to 4%, inflation from 2% to 22%, Singapore saw the worst of outcomes. Other countries in Southeast Asia who were oil producers latched on to how they were seeing increases in revenue. Right? So they were actually well placed. But Singapore was hit with both an increase in potential unemployment and an increase in inflation. It was the worst of both. So what did the government do? The government said, the first priority is we protect the people. Right? So we have supermarkets, we go after price gouging by profiteering firms. People felt safe and reassured. Second, what's the long-term strategy given this? Singapore which digs no hydrocarbons out of the ground, pivoted, investing in massive facilities for downstream petrochemicals processing and for oil refining. So that Singapore today is a global hub in that branch of the energy landscape. And it became very profitable for Singapore. Singapore latched on to subsequent double-digit growth once again after this short hiccup. This kind of forward-looking strategic thinking, is so important. Many other nations not doing this. They're, as you say, running around controlling this, rationing that. Whereas Singapore seems to be thinking, okay, what's the next stage of what we need to do now? What's the diversification we need?
I want to ask Sheana about prices because it affects everything now. And it's largely gas and oil supplies that are being caught up in the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, right? So why are we seeing the prices of everything else go up?
Because, you need oil in some form. Not maybe the crude form, but the refined form, as Prof. Daniel was just mentioning. The refined form goes into petroleum that you need to drive the trucks, into the fuel that you need for the jets, for the ships. All of these, the prices of all of these have definitely gone up. We've seen, I think, in the last 6 weeks or so, I think some of these refined prices have gone up, have nearly doubled, actually. So all of that will inevitably somehow eventually feed through to higher consumer prices through, if producers are unable to absorb all of that cost into their margin, they will have to pass it on to consumers. And that's how we are eventually going to see it at the receiving end when we enter a supermarket, for example. Just higher cost for them to put the electricity on, higher cost for them to bring in the food or any other grocery that you might find. So that's kind of like the loop towards raising prices for consumers.
Since we're talking about raising prices, in Parliament, they also announced support measures, right? So there's a CDC vouchers and there are handouts as well. Do you think it's sufficient enough to deal with the knock-on effects, especially when you say, your inflation numbers are being recalibrated? Is a couple $100 enough now?
Well, is it enough to completely mitigate and offset the entire hit? I don't think so. But it does definitely help to buffer households through at least this couple of months. I think one of the most significant of these measures that were announced were bringing forward the CDC vouchers from next January to June, because that directly reaches the pockets of households. The other measures that were announced will also be helpful, especially for those Grab drivers, the ride-sharing drivers. So that will definitely help with them trying to maintain some level of real disposable income. It will still be hit, but the hit will not be as massive, so allowing some of that purchasing power to still remain. But do I think we need more in future, in the coming months? Possibly, if the ceasefire doesn't hold for as long as we all hope for, 2 weeks. If even after the ceasefire, everything still goes back to where it was in square one, we'll probably see more sustained supply disruptions. And even if the ceasefire holds for the 2 weeks, the fact that we had a 6-week disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, that's going to have ripple effects. Even if the strait opens today, it still takes around 2 to 3 weeks for a tanker to reach wherever in the world. So there is already that lag. There is that disruption that has been existing for the last 6 weeks, going to prolong for at least 8 more weeks, even if that ceasefire holds. So,
jump in on this. The calibration that's required is a very delicate one, as you already suggest, Natasha, because what we want to do is to make sure that people don't suffer inordinately, but at the same time, we shouldn't set off what is sometimes known as a wage price cycle in accelerating inflation, where people become accustomed to the idea that prices will rise at a certain rate. They ask for their wages to do the same. In fact, a little bit of a top up, then prices have to rise to keep up. And then wages rise again. There's a wage price accelerator in this that we need to be mindful of. Yeah. So the calculation that needs to be done needs to trade off these two different things. But when we look at, say, oil prices per barrel before all this began were between $70, $80. Today, they're a little bit over 100. Every now and then they bounce below 100 and they might bounce back up depending. So you might say, well, that's a 30-35% change. But then we can't forget that fertilizer, ammonia, the ingredients that go into the food that gets produced all around the world also come through the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait and the Gulf region is responsible for perhaps 80% of the ammonia that gets used in urea and then fertilizer. And there's a huge important cycle there because farmers need to plan how much they plant, how much they can expect from how much fertilizer that they can input. Now, that doesn't affect Singapore directly. We don't have huge farms where people are producing corn, but that affects the food that Singaporeans will import. And so there's another price cycle that's happening in parallel with just the fuel and energy. And there's an invisible part of the food chain that will be affected if this Strait of Hormuz blockage continues.
I'm curious to find out if you all think this kind of has echoes of COVID-19, like in terms of, not getting things and then people having to queue up and the working from home, not here yet, but, how is it different in your opinion? I mean, Sheana, do you have a take on this?
I can see some of the similarities between now and COVID-19, as you mentioned. But I think we will only get to that stage where we have to queue up and there's no supply if the energy supply completely stops. We are not yet at that stage. The Strait of Hormuz there is an effective closure there, but they kind of, I think they're only responsible for roughly 20% of oil, of all the world's oil. So there is still some flow happening that should prevent us from reaching the same kind of this extent that we saw in COVID-19.
But it does affect 80% of Asia. I mean, it's a lot of the region that's affected, this region that's affected by just this blockade, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Then you were going to say?
Well, I was going to say that, I lived through the OPEC oil crisis in the United States.
Then you have to rely on you here.
I lived through that, and it made a big impression on me because that's the kind of shortage and rationing you don't expect to see in what was then obviously the world's leading nation, the world's richest economy. I was used to how growing up and experience in other parts of Asia, you could get regular brownouts, or the electricity had to be turned off to conserve what they needed for the rest of the week. But in America, that you saw rationing of that kind because OPEC had decided to restrict its oil exports to the United States, and by the 1970s and early 1980s, that was a much more important part of American oil and gas provision than in 1973. And so you'd walk around and you'd see lines of cars outside gas stations waiting to get gas, waiting to get filled up. And if they were unlucky, they came too late, they would have to be turned away. That's the kind of rationing you don't expect to see. And that's the kind of rationing that's very unnerving. Once you're used to, as we are in Singapore, a society where things work. When something like that breaks down, it is very disconcerting. Now, are we close to that? I don't think so. And part of the reason is that consequential that it is, the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, it's right now affecting fertilizer, it's affecting oil and gas. And as you said, that does show up in price inflation everywhere. But compare that with our own recent experience with shortages, the COVID pandemic. There, it wasn't just the Strait of Hormuz that was blockaded. All ports, the entire world over, no longer operated. Shipping lines were shut down, airline flights were canceled. And there, people actually did worry, and there was this big rush to the nearest Sheng Siong for instant noodles and toilet paper.
Yes,
because people knew then rationally that the whole thing was affected. Today, it's consequential. The impact on inflation and output cannot be underestimated at this point. But we also need to keep calm about how the rest of the system needs to be allowed to continue to work.
I mean, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer about this, but Sheana, are we headed for a recession? Hearing your talk, so are we headed for a recession?
Well, in terms of our latest kind of forecast in building in the numbers of what we expect to be the length of this supply disruption, what we're seeing is we actually 3/4 of contraction, but very mild contraction in Q-on-Q, seasonally adjusted terms. It's actually not even 1%. It's really small. So what is happening here is actually more a story of a slowdown rather than a deep recession that we are expecting for Singapore this year. And that mostly reflects, just as Prof. Danny had mentioned earlier, just some of these, the fact that output will be hit and inflation will rise. These are things that even as the government tries to mitigate the full impact, it's not going to be able to absorb everything. Yeah, so this is something that we can expect this year.
Well, Danny, you mentioned this word stagflation earlier. And PM Wong actually mentioned stagflation in a video message that he gave. Why is this a worry for a small country like this?
Okay. Well, first let me say it's a worry for all countries. For all economies, stagflation is just bad news. Part of that is that we have well-known, well-understood policy tools to attack the problem of inflation. We have well-known, well-understood problems to attack the problem of stagnation. Where things get hard is when these two happen together. Because when there's stagnation, we typically think we can boost the economy, we can increase government spending, lower taxes, increase investment incentives. That will get the economy going again. But if all that's happening when inflation is also high, then you worry that what you're doing, it might not actually bring the economy out of recession, but simply instead fuel inflation further. So that's the difficulty. That's difficulty for all economies, including for Singapore. Now, Singapore is a small, open, it's a quintessential small, open economy, but much more than that. Singapore trades 300% of its GDP. Every dollar that you and I and everybody else in Singapore produces, 3 times that gets traded across Singapore's borders. So for us in Singapore, international trade, the prosperity of all other nations is essential to Singapore's continued prosperity, that there be this free flow of goods and services. Now, stagflation is particularly pernicious because we've got difficulty with its tools, and we worry that everybody else around us will mess up. And if they mess up, that has huge impact on us here. It has huge impact everywhere. But I think the reason for worrying about that is that openness is a positive impact multiplier. Trade is a positive impact multiplier. But when things go wrong, we need to be especially vigilant.
So I hear you. And so based on what Danny has said, Sheana, we're not in stagflation, correct? But what you were saying earlier is that there is kind of like this slowdown that is expected, not a deep recession yet.
Yes.
But in the larger scheme of things, should we be worried about job losses, or is there any particular segments of society that should be the most worried?
Are there any particular segments of society? I think those would be probably the ones that are more directly involved in the oil kind of supply, the energy kind of supply chain. So, for example, if you are more in like aviation sector, for example, that's probably where things could be a little bit more vulnerable initially. Aviation, some of these sectors, maybe some of like the ride-sharing ones, those that really depend very much on fuel as part of your input. I think that's where things will be a little bit more precarious initially. I think elsewhere, there isn't really a particular segment, I'd say. It's more generally just the more lower income households that will really feel the bigger hit for a longer period of time. So.
Thank you for explaining. I was also thinking about like how we will cope with this, but I did want to go back to Danny's. Very early on, you brought up the rules-based order in this world, right? And for 60 years, our prosperity has been dependent on free trade, open shipping lanes, and the rule-based international order. But with the way things are going, Danny, are we holding on to a rule book that everyone else has thrown away? We keep like waving. It's like, let's play by the rules, but nobody else is. Yeah. So what do you make of how we are conducting our diplomacy nowadays?
I think there's a genuine long-run risk. First, let me say that, in a sense, I have to agree with some of the naysayers that openness has its limits on how we can benefit from it. Sheer naive openness was an idea that came from the mid-20th century that said that we could organize the world in a globalized multilateral way where everything was open, there was a level playing field, and markets were perfectly free. And I think that stood us in good stead. But events, we've taken the right lesson from some recent events. The COVID pandemic taught us that there are limits to that model. We need to, at the same time, have an eye on resilience and economic security. And if that means a little bit less openness, our societies are willing to pay that price. I think all societies, all countries have pivoted in that direction. So there's a little bit less openness at the margin now, and that is for good reason. But there's also a lot less openness for bad reasons. Reasons where nations are protectionist, there's a rise of populism, there's extreme nationalism, where what's mine is mine and I don't want the rest of the world to share my prosperity. And that is damaging the rules-based order, and it's damaging Singapore. Singapore has prospered from the fact that it's able to trade with everyone on a level playing field, where the rest of the world is committed to peaceful dispute resolution, rule of law, and a tendency to cooperate. What you're referring to, Natasha, is the going away of that last part. That last part is dangerous. Even as we navigate towards a safer, open economy, we need to not allow the bad to overwhelm the good. Just as we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, we also can't let the bad overwhelm what's good in the international system.
Sheana, is this new world order or disorder, going to affect how Singapore does business?
I think it's. I suppose what's going to happen is that we'll probably see more cautious behavior, but it's not going to completely affect. So, as Prof. Danny had mentioned, having it being open is useful and beneficial for Singapore. Diversification away to different kinds of trading partners is always helpful, and ensuring that that kind of provides some kind of flexibility. For example, right now, what we're seeing in the Strait of Hormuz, right, with that closure there, Singapore's not completely bounded. We've got other alternative suppliers, for example, Australia for LNG. So that is obviously always going to be a good, and that's probably what should continue moving forward. But it does expose Singapore to some vulnerabilities. Go ahead.
So I want to build on this because this idea, what you mentioned, that greater collaboration with Australia is an open option. See, what that tells me is that the New World Order does not have to have everybody in the world in that order. It just to have in it those who are willing, like-minded, and believe in the rules of the international system. Most favored nation, trading on a level playing field. Not everybody believes in those rules now, but the rest of the world that does is actually quite large. And we can build a new world order that's a group of the coalition of the willing. Or in technical, geeky economics language, I might say an incentive-compatible, rules-based multilateralism. For those who continue to believe the rules work and who have the incentive to be part of this. Now, the natural candidate for not being part of this is the United States at this point, because it does not think this system benefits it. The rest of us might wish that America could be in this system. It makes all of us more prosperous and more secure. But if America does not want to be part of the new world order, we have to wish it well and say it's off to be surrounded by just friends and fish. And the rest of us have to deal with a world that still wants to trade and grow economically prosperous from international economic exchange.
So Singapore will never be the naughty kid. Wow. Well, Sheana, do you think we'll do anything differently economically based on where this war is taking us?
Economically, I think there are many things that Singapore will probably do from here on. One of the things was mentioned earlier, for example, diversifying our energy supplies towards more renewables. That's something that has already started. and it's probably something that's going to continue, embarking forward.
Will this war accelerate? Because they were talking about it in quite extensively in Parliament about, okay, we now need to look at different sources or different types of energy. Do you think this war will, push them to, bring forward deadlines on things that they want to do with different energy sources?
Yeah, I think so. For example, back in 2022, it was because of what happened in 22 that accelerated Singapore's commitment to ensure we have stockpiles. Like it made all, the government, ensured, or rather made sure that all power generation plants now has to have a certain level of inventories, which was never the case before. Yeah. So all of this will, it will push forward. This is the kind of a hit that you need, and then just to kick you off. And I think, yes, it will accelerate a lot of these things forward.
Yeah. South Korea and Japan were very badly hit in the first OPEC oil shock. They imported all their energy use. Today, they have strategic oil reserves.
Yeah.
They're looking at what's happening now in the Strait of Hormuz, and they say, well, this is a sharp disruption, but will be okay for the short term. They've built an industry, employment, jobs around the idea that they can keep energy security. And that's a direction that Singapore has gone in the past, and it's a direction that suggests that new employment, new industry, new jobs can come from the unfortunate circumstances we find ourselves in.
We are talking broadly about the rules-based order, and even in the region, not everybody will agree with how we are conducting our diplomacy, and not everybody, like you said, Danny, not everyone play by the rules, right? Then how does the new world order look like? Because even comments this morning from Malaysian politician. Did you see it? Nurul Izzah Anwar was saying that Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishna's comments on the Strait of Hormuz were regrettable, what he said in Parliament, right? Yeah. So how do we navigate this whole, especially if even our neighbours are commenting on it?
I think on the specifics of the Strait of Hormuz, on Iran, on America and Israel's actions, there's a diversity of opinion. I think that if we look at the facts here about the actual risks and dangers there, and we calibrate that against what's happening in the rest of the world, for me, the war should not be happening. But that's for me, and I see how others would disagree with that. However, the principle of it is that we look for willing partners who are in agreement with us on building a new world order of trade. So I think we've already begun to do that, Singapore and others. The Future of International Trade Partnerships, Investment and Trade Partnerships, FITP, is one such organization. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which is focused on ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus China, South Korea, Japan, is already such a partnership. And in this, we don't agree on everything, but we agree on enough about promoting trade and investment, sharing best practice. And I think it's those kinds of groupings that we go into. We look for those areas where there's agreement, and we realize that we're going to disagree about some things. Let's talk about that. We don't think, I think most reasonable societies don't think those are irreconcilable, but let's put that to one side and work on the things that we do agree on. And it seems to me that's a very Asian approach to constructing a new world order. America and the West comes along, the first thing they say is, do you believe in our values? We go and say, do you want to trade? Do you believe in joint economic prosperity? Work on the things that we share rather than the things that divide us. And I think that is the way in which we're going to build this new world order.
So I want to end off on this question, and because I brought up Foreign Affairs Minister Vivian, right? So he actually said at a press conference on Tuesday that the economic fallout from the war in Iran could worsen, and markets have yet to factor in worst case scenario. And I'm actually scared to ask, but Sheana, maybe you can kick us off, right? Or take us home by telling me, what does a worst case scenario look like to you?
I guess, well, for us, I think a worst case scenario is probably a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and probably also intensify kind of war activity in the Middle East region. For us, prolonged would probably be something like closure of around 6 months. We are coming up to around 6 weeks now, and let's see how well this ceasefire goes on for and what happens after that. But if it really comes to 6 months, you're probably also we're expecting to see oil prices probably go up to 150 kind of levels. At the same time, we'll probably, a lot of the economies, especially in Asia, the more developing economies, will probably already start to face very acute energy shortages. In Singapore, 2 days ago, as you mentioned, the ministers have all come together. I think what's key there is that they didn't give any kind of panic or alarm bells ringing, but they did say that we all have the individual responsibility to try and conserve energy. So if we start doing that now, if everybody really starts doing that earnestly, maybe we could probably still pass through that 6 months quite all right in terms of our energy supply, but prices will rise, amongst other things.
I would just like to declare I'm very okay to work from home.
Yeah.
Very okay. But Danny, what does worst case scenario look like for you?
Everything that you've said, I agree with. In addition, there are other areas of military conflict, potential military conflict around the world, and that are a lot closer to us. There's contestation in Taiwan Strait and in the South China Sea. Right? There is the view that America, who used to be the supporter of the international system, maintainer of peace and security, has decided that's not the way it approaches the world anymore. It's might makes right. They are the superpower. They get to do things that they neither apologize for nor beg for forgiveness. That they can trample over all of the Indo-Pacific is, in their view, something that's within their warship capabilities. So I think a worst-case scenario would be the outbreak of organized international violence on a scale that only America can engineer. That would have, in our region, in our neighborhood, in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea, that would compound all the difficulties in the same direction. That would be, if not the very worst-case scenario, a worse-case than before scenario.
Well, let's hope we will not get there. Again, but thank you both very much for sharing your thoughts and opinions on what's happening now. And that's it from The Usual Place today. Now, if you're watching us on YouTube, do subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you won't miss new episodes of the podcast. If you have thoughts on what we discuss, do drop a comment on YouTube or talk to me on Instagram at The Usual Place Podcast. I'll see you next Thursday at noon.